Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the latest installment in our series, The Global Church, run by the World Religions World Church program in the Department of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. This particular series is dedicated to the church in Asia. I am Gabriel Reynolds and director of the World Religions World Church program, also the Crowley Professor of Islamic Studies and Theology. You notice my principal work is Islamic Studies, so I'm here mostly as a moderator and a timekeeper. We're really grateful that you're spending these 3 weeks with us as we explore the church in Asia, and we hope that you find your experience generally with a global church, including our earlier series on the church and Islam and the church in Africa, insightful and engaging. I'd like to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors. These include the Tontor Ecumenical Institute in Jerusalem, the McGrath Institute for Church Life, Notre Dame International, and the Notre Dame Alumni Association, and to add an extra word of thanks for ThinkND for all of the great programming they offer us, and also the way they help form a family of Notre Dame alumni and friends. We are going to have the first part of this session, a discussion with two distinguished professors, but in the latter part of the session, we'll have an opportunity to receive questions from you, from the audience. And so you should see in the chat box now a link to a form which will allow you to ask a question. And that's the way we'll receive your questions. There it is, it's up right now. In a way that will be hopefully useful for you, easy, but also allow us to get to as many questions as possible at the end. What a pleasure it is to discuss the topic of the Church in Asia with Professor Rob Gimello, Professor Emeritus of the Department of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. Professor Gimello received his PhD from Columbia University and taught at Harvard University before moving up and joining the faculty at Notre Dame. He is the author of a number of works on classical East Asian Buddhism, for example, the entry Enlightenment in the Encyclopedia of Buddhism, and also on theological connections between Buddhism and Catholic theology. He published an article entitled A Depth of Otherness, Buddhism and Benedict XVI's Theology of Religions, and a work edited by John Cavadini, Explorations in the Theology of Benedict XVI. So thank you so much for being here, Professor Gimello.
My pleasure, thank you.
I don't know if you would like to add another work or two. Maybe I missed a big one that our audience should know about, or is that good for now?
No, I think that should do it, right, yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I'm also joined today with someone familiar to you if you were with us last week, Professor Xueying Wang, alumna of Notre Dame Theology from our PhD program and professor at Loyola, Chicago. So welcome back, Professor Wang.
Hi, good to be here again.
Good to be with you again. Thank you. Friends, our topic this week is Buddhism and the Church in China. So we had some explorations of the roots of Christianity and the development of the church through two principal waves of Christianity and Christian missions last week. And this week, we'll speak a little bit about the roots and development of Buddhism, specifically in China. But then we'll move on to how Buddha is related to Christians in China. And at the end, we're going to pay particular attention to a fascinating character, a famous Chinese Catholic from the 20th century named John Wu, who, as we'll see, served in diplomatic roles for the Republic of China, but also translated the New Testament into Chinese, and so has extraordinary accomplishments and activities both in the diplomatic and in the theological or religious domains. But we're going to begin with Buddhism, and I'll ask Xueying to begin.
Sure. Well, before we get to Chinese Buddhism, Professor Gimello, could you start with like a general background to Buddhism? In general, like, could you give us a very brief introduction to Buddhism?
Those are, of course, impossible questions, but the Buddhism is one of the world's major proselytizing religions. It began approximately 3 centuries prior to Christ in northeastern India, spread within a couple of centuries throughout the Indian subcontinent, then into Central Asia, across the deserts and mountains of Central Asia, into China, arriving there round about the beginning of the Common Era. And over the course of just a few centuries, inserted itself in a variety of ways into Chinese culture, civilization, politics, society, and the transmission of Buddhism to East Asia, especially to China, is, I think, a remarkable example of transmission of religions across cultures. It's quite unlike the way in which religions were transmitted, other religions were transmitted outside the realms of their origins to other or alien cultures. It was never spread to East Asia by force. It was never a centrally directed, intentionally missionary activity controlled by a central authority. And it was remarkably successful, to the point, much more successful, I should mention, than the transmission of Christianity to China. And the result of all of this, I think, was a process by which you could say that China became a Buddhist country, a Buddhist culture, a Buddhist civilization. And this is especially remarkable because the civilization in which Buddhism arose, that of ancient India, and the civilization to which Buddhism was transmitted in China are as unlike one another as it is possible for two cultures or civilizations to be. They had precious little contact before the transmission of Buddhism. They are in many, many ways very different from one another. And yet, despite those differences, Buddhism took deep root in Chinese culture. But that process of taking root in Chinese culture was all the more remarkable, I think, because it was done without any fundamental alteration in the character of the Buddhist religion. For quite some time, it was common for scholars of Buddhism in East Asia to speak of the Sinicization of Buddhism, as though Buddhism became something other than what it had originally been when it entered China. But that's not the case. Buddhism has retained its integrity, accommodating Chinese culture in a variety of ways, but without ever altering its essential character. By the 5th or 6th century after its arrival in China, it was a major force in the intellectual life of the Chinese elite, in Chinese art and literature, in all aspects of Chinese culture. And it continues today as a major ingredient in Chinese culture, although like other religions that we find in China, it suffers contemporary forms of oppression in China and is struggling to maintain itself, just as Christianity is in China.
Very interesting. Can I jump in here, Professor Gemello? I wonder if I can ask a two-part question. One is really a basic question, and it's another one of those impossible ones. But just could you maybe speak a little bit about basic teaching, Buddhist teaching? So in my head, there's something about a certain path and certain noble truths and something about escape from suffering, but in a way that would be common to all forms of Buddhism. That's sort of the first part question. What would be the 2 or 3 things that someone like me who's an amateur should know?
Over the centuries, Buddhism has routinely identified itself with what it calls the 4 noble truths. The truth of suffering, which is identified as a fundamental component of sentient or human existence. Even human experiences that are not conventionally regarded as suffering or painful in ordinary parlance are regarded by Buddhists as forms of suffering or unease or dissatisfaction. And the purpose of Buddhism is to escape that. But to escape it, and here we come to the second of the 4 noble truths, it's necessary to understand where suffering or pain originates. And the remarkable discovery of Buddhism was that it originates within the mind and intention of those who suffer. It's not a condition imposed on human beings by a hostile cosmos or by a hostile deity. Human beings create their own suffering. And that is usually said to arise specifically from the human tendency always to desire, to crave things, to crave the cessation of pain, to crave the continuation of pleasure. Every element of human mental existence is understood in Buddhism to be a kind of expression of craving. The mind in Buddhism is describable as a prehensile faculty. The mind does not just reflect the way things are, it's an agent that reaches out into the world and grabs at things or fends things away. But Buddhists also discovered that this tendency to crave, it has itself deeper roots. And the deepest of those roots is ignorance. Buddhists teach that we crave things and therefore suffer because we fail to understand how things truly are. The third noble truth, which is perhaps the more optimistic truth taught in Buddhism, is that suffering, no matter how deeply rooted it is in human craving or in human ignorance, is nonetheless, it is possible nonetheless to make it cease, to escape it. And that is the third of Buddhism's Four Noble Truths, the possibility of the cessation of suffering. The fourth and final noble truth, which is in a sense the most elaborately formulated, is the truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering by overcoming ignorance and thereby overcoming craving. And the entire elaborate, fascinating edifice of Buddhist thought, the systems of Buddhist philosophy, are all ways of implementing those Four Noble Truths.
I see.
There was nothing quite like this view of the human condition in China, which had its own definition of the human condition.
Now, you mentioned that, if I just follow up, Xueying, with one additional question.
Of course.
You mentioned that there wasn't a trend in earlier scholarship to speak of the adaptation of Buddhism in a Chinese context. And you suggested that maybe that is an inaccurate way of describing the continuity of basic Buddhist teaching that is found also in the Chinese context. So, but are there ways in which there is a distinctive flavor or particular creative thinkers among Chinese Buddhists, so that you could say, oh, well, this is distinctive to Chinese Buddhism, whereas in other places, say Sri Lanka or Southeast Asia, maybe Burma or a place like this, there would be different flavors, different thinkers, different trends. Does that make sense?
It does. And flavor, I think, is the appropriate term. There is a remarkable degree of continuity linking Buddhism in all of its Asian manifestations. But overlaying that essential commonality are a number of ways in which Buddhism has accommodated itself to its host civilizations. The way in which it inserted itself into Chinese political life, for example. The way in which it adapted the forms of Chinese artistic and literary expression, the way in which it amalgamated itself, melded itself with important values in Chinese culture, like the value of family or filial piety.
Right.
All of those things are part of the fascinating story of Buddhism's change in China, but never change to the at the expense of its essential identity as another religion. For example, although the Chinese Buddhist tradition made various accommodations with the Chinese family system, especially with the doctrine of filial piety, it remained remarkably faithful to the monastic tradition of celibacy. Unlike other parts of Asia, for example, Japan, where most Buddhist monks have for centuries been married men with offspring. Right. Chinese Buddhism has remained amazingly faithful to the principle of monastic celibacy. So those are a few of the examples. When Buddhism was challenged in a variety of ways when it first arrived in China, having been seen by the Chinese as foreign, maybe even as dangerous. For example, celibacy itself was seen by many Chinese when Buddhism first arrived, and even later, as a threat to the Chinese value of filial piety, because the most essential duty of a filial son is to produce offspring.
For the sake of the grandparents or the potential grandparents.
And Buddhist monks didn't do that. So Chinese tradition had to find a way of accepting Buddhism, which they found in many ways very attractive, despite their hesitancy, deep hesitancy about the practice of celibacy.
Right.
Just to build up on that, so maybe could you elaborate on the reason why Buddhism was so successful in China? Because as you mentioned, it's really a very different culture from Confucianism and Taoism, the indigenous cultures in China prior to its arrival. And as you mentioned, actually, like the filial piety point, later attackers of Buddhism, we often heard that phrase, 无父无君, no father and no king, because it's tied together, the two. So could you explain maybe a little bit why it could, get a pass eventually and be successful in China?
Yeah, despite that, the difficulties, right? I think it's because of the intrinsic attraction of the Buddhist view of life. The notion that in the doctrine of karma, for example, the doctrine of rebirth morally determined, one's future conditions are understood in Buddhist teaching to be dependent upon one's present actions. One's present condition is said to be conditioned by one's previous actions in prior lives. This offered a very powerful theodicy to the Chinese, a way of explaining the deficiencies, the difficulties of the human condition without indicting the cosmos or the political system. And this proved to be very early on a deeply attractive notion to the Chinese. Also, Buddhism expanded the Chinese cosmos enormously. What we might call cosmology in ancient China was more like what we would today call geography. That is to say, the world of ancient China was finite. The heavens and the like recognized in pre-Buddhist Chinese religion were all nearby in Tibet or somewhere like that. Whereas the Buddhist view of the cosmos is comparable to that of modern astrophysics, the limitless cosmos comprising tens of thousands of millions of billions of world systems. All of that Buddhist view of the cosmos was, for many Chinese, kind of liberating. It depicted for them a world much more vast than anything they had known, and it also rooted the difficulties of the human condition within the mind rather than within the external circumstances of the cosmos or the political situation. These were powerful ideas, which were so powerful that Chinese often were drawn to Buddhism despite Buddhism's seeming contradiction of basic Chinese values like filial piety.
So Xueying, Would you like to go on to a question about maybe theology, Christian theology and Buddhism?
Sure. Actually, last week, Gabriel asked me a question. So why was Buddhism so successful and Christianity not so successful? So just to follow up on that, I mean, Christianity has also broadened the cosmos with, like God and angels and heaven and hell. But I want to hear your take on why Christianity was not successful, and or could there be like a meaningful dialogue? I mean, this is like changing the direction a little bit between Christianity and Buddhism.
There certainly can be meaningful dialogue, and there has been meaningful dialogue between Buddhism and Christianity. Most of that dialogue has not occurred within the Chinese context. If you examine the last century of dialogue or conversation between Buddhism and Christianity, between Buddhists and Catholic Christians, for example, most of the Buddhism engaged in that conversation has been the sort of Buddhism that you find outside of China, in Sri Lanka, Thailand, Burma, maybe more recently in Tibet, to a great extent in Japan and Korea. Those are the realms in which a Buddhist-Christian dialogue has most flourished, not so much, oddly enough, in China. So you don't find a history of deep intellectual engagement on the part of most Chinese intellectuals in Buddhism, nor much engagement on the part of Christians in China, for example, missionaries in the study of Buddhism, which from very early times was looked upon with disdain by many, as you probably surely know, by many Christian missionaries, Catholic and Protestant. How Buddhism succeeded, whereas Christianity didn't, it's another one of those big questions. Blessed are they who know the reasons for things, right? But I think another point about Buddhism that I think I should have mentioned at the outset, Buddhism has a pedagogical principle that it often invokes. The term for this is in Sanskrit, upaya, which is usually translated as expedient means, expedient device. Buddhism is, in the way in which it communicates its basic truths, remarkably flexible, far more so than was the case with most Christians who arrived in China, who were more intent on maintaining a strict separation of their tradition from the traditions of the host country. That principle of upaya, fangbian in Chinese, expedient flexibility, accounts to a considerable extent for the practical success of Buddhism in China. When early Christian missionaries in the 16th, 17th century came to China, they toyed with ideas that were essentially forbidden of, for example, offering the Eucharist under the species of rice rather than bread. Right? That was a kind of flexibility not admissible in, for example, the Catholic missionary tradition. Buddhists would not have been particularly distressed to accommodate Buddhist ritual, Chinese ritual practices, but never to the extent of giving up something they regarded as essential, like the tradition of monastic celibacy.
Right, right. Can I ask actually about an earlier stage of Christianity in China? We heard from Professor Wang last week about the records we have of it's an incredible story of Christians who came from Central Asia, even further to the west, Iran and even Iraq, who are sometimes called Nestorian Christians, but more properly Church of the East or East Syrian Christians. And we have some records, a famous stele of explaining the missionary activities and the flowering of Christianity under their missionary work in the 7th to 9th centuries. And then Professor Wang explained how in an anti-Buddhist persecution, I hope I'm getting this right, the Christians suffered as well. And there were almost no traces that that survived of this early Christian presence. Can you tell us anything about their interaction with Buddhism, so this early stage of Christianity in China, and why the Christians also suffered under an anti-Buddhist persecution?
The anti-Buddhist persecution was, in a larger sense, persecution of non-Chinese traditions. Buddhism persecuted to a considerable extent because it was not Chinese. The same opposition to other imported religions like the Church of the East, Zoroastrianism. The period in which all of this occurred was the period known in Chinese dynastic history as the Tang Dynasty, from the early 7th to the mid 9th century. And that was a remarkably, throughout most of its course, remarkably cosmopolitan age in Chinese culture. China was full of foreign visitors, bringing with them their own culture, their own languages. But this occasionally was perceived as threatening. And there were several episodes of hostility towards all things foreign. But that hostility, those persecutions were short-lived. Their effects were not permanent. It used to be thought that after the great mid-9th century persecution of Buddhism and other foreign religions, they all but disappeared or went into a sharp and continuous decline. But that's not true. Buddhism revived remarkably well after that terrible persecution. But Christianity was, the Church of the East was a very recent import into China. And I think I put it in various occasions, it had not yet become a Chinese religion. It was a religion of resident aliens, those foreigners from Central Asia and beyond who were, for reasons of trade and the like, taking up residence in China. They brought with them their tradition, established a few institutions which served their needs, but would never attracted Chinese conversion or participation.
Thank you.
It's funny when that one of those records of the Church of the East in China was discovered in the 1500s, a huge inscribed stele with Chinese inscription and Syriac inscriptions. When that discovery was made in the 16th century, about the time that the Jesuits were first popping up in China, and they reported back on this discovery, and many people in Europe accused them of faking it. They could not believe that there was Christianity in China and accused the Jesuits of a hoax. It took some time for scholars to come to appreciate that there actually were Christians, foreign Christians, present in the capital of China in the 7th, 8th, 9th century.
Not the last time someone would make accusations against Jesuits. But
no,
that's another story.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Jesuits were very excited when they found the Xi'an stele, and to prove that the antiquity of Christianity, which is considered something good in Chinese culture, to be old, like an old tradition. But the Jesuits actually thought that, and they claimed that the stele was from Catholics, which was also not true. But anyway, so we're very excited also to hear about your views on Zhang Wu. But before we get there, let me just ask another question about Buddhism. So it's another impossible question, very broad. So what is it like to live like a Buddhist today in China? So we hear about these branches like Zen Buddhists and Pure Land Buddhists. And is there a sharp division of branches in China among Buddhists?
Not so sharp as we might be inclined to believe. Western European and American, North American acquaintance with East Asian Buddhism began through an acquaintance with Buddhism in Japan. And in Japan, Buddhism is sharply divided into various sects. which are in many ways at loggerheads with one another and are concerned to sharply distinguish themselves from each other. That was never really the case in China. We speak of different schools of Buddhism in China, but they're not what we call sects or schools of Buddhism in Japan. So there's a kind of amalgamation of different intellectual and practical and liturgical traditions in Chinese Buddhism that you'll find all various forms of Buddhist piety, various schemes of Buddhist thought mixed together in different institutions. But the most important thing to bear in mind about the condition of Buddhism in China today, what it's like to be a Buddhist in China today, is that Buddhists are under strict and sometimes very hostile control by the government, to something like the same extent to which Christianity is under. When you read about under oppression from the government, when you read about churches being destroyed, Catholic and Protestant churches being destroyed in China, home churches being closed down, crosses being torn down from churches, you'll find similar events occurring even with regard to Buddhism in China today. Very distressing. This is a fairly recent development. For a short time after the Cultural Revolution, Buddhism enjoyed government favor, but that's not the case any longer. So it's difficult to be a Buddhist in China today. But there still is Buddhism, right? So,
well, I'm going to turn our conversation to another topic, but also in the contemporary period. We've mentioned in the introduction the figure of John Wu. This is someone I believe you have a personal connection to. And, I mentioned in the introduction just a few things, that he has this diplomatic legacy, but also theological religious legacy. So could you basically introduce, I understand he ended up in the United States. Well, he maybe began there, went back to China, came back to the United States, dies only in the 1980s. Who is John Wu and why is he important?
Yeah, John Wu is a figure with whom I have a close connection and towards whom I owe an enormous debt, because he was one of the first people to introduce me to the wonders of Chinese civilization, including Chinese Buddhism, when I was wet behind the ears undergraduate, beginning my study of Chinese language. He was the offspring of a middle-class Chinese family in the southern coastal region of China, who initially intended to pursue a career in science, but found himself, while still a teenager, more interested in law. There was a great deal of attention in China in the early 20th century with law as one of the elements of Western civilization that Chinese had to come to terms with and could perhaps profit by. Became a student of law. In the course of his study in a Western law school founded by a Methodist institution, he was converted to Protestant Christianity. But eventually, the story is complicated, he converted to Catholicism during the early days of the Japanese invasion of China. Was deeply moved by his encounter with elements of Catholicism, living representatives of the Catholic tradition in whom he knew personally, but also deeply moved by reading of things like the writings of the little flower, Therese of Lisieux, and underwent a rather deep and fairly sudden conversion to Catholic Christianity. He was, by training, a jurist, had a law degree in China, came to the United States, took a law degree at the University of Michigan, struck up a conversation with Oliver Wendell Holmes, which continued until Holmes' death. Their letters survive. Returned to China and served as a judge in Shanghai for a couple of decades while moving in the direction of his conversion to Catholicism. became a friend of Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the nationalist Chinese movement, who was himself, you may know, a Christian, a Methodist, not a Catholic, but they were friends of each other. And at Chiang Kai-shek's urging, he undertook to translate, as you mentioned, Gabriel, the New Testament into not just Chinese, but classical Chinese, which was a remarkable and unprecedented achievement. He also translated into classical Chinese poetry the Psalms, impressing his literary compatriots, even those who were not Christian, but also drawing himself more closely into the graces of Chiang Kai-shek, who eventually, after 1949, when Chiang Kai-shek moved to Taiwan, appointed John Woo to various positions in the nationalist government, including he was the minister of the nationalist government to the Vatican, and came to know personally Pope Pius XII, but also was appointed by Chiang Kai-shek to the World Court in The Hague. Came back to the United States to help create the law school at my university, Seton Hall University, retired from that position and began teaching in the newly founded Department of Asian Studies courses on Chinese culture, literature, religion, philosophy, and that's where I met him. Eventually, after his wife, mother of his 13 children, died, he moved to Taiwan, remarried, some years later, died, I think in 1986. There's a couple of his offspring, his sons, are still alive, only a couple of them, but he has a large collection of grandchildren.
I would think so.
I've met, right? So, remarkable figure, because he was deeply immersed in the Chinese cultural traditions. Not only the religions and philosophies of China, but also their literary traditions. Very famous for his studies of Tang Dynasty poetry, classical Chinese poetry, for example. But somehow managed to combine in fascinating and instructive ways his deep devotion to the Chinese traditions, his respect for them, his admiration for them, combine all of that with a deeply devout and deeply informed, theologically informed commitment to Catholicism. So I regard him not only as an important figure in his own day, but also as a model of how Chinese Christians can cultivate their Christianity while also appreciating and developing their Chinese heritage. Right?
Thank you. Just to check in here in terms of time, we have about 7 more minutes for our questions, and then we'll turn over to questions from the audience for both of you. So,
okay.
Yes,
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that fascinating story with John Woo. So he certainly has left us many legacies, and among which there was the translation of the New Testament into classical Chinese, as you mentioned. Could you expand a little more on that and tell us about what's distinctive about John Woo's New Testament translation as compared to other versions of New Testament translations in Chinese? And did he find ways of communicating the gospel that would be meaningful in a Chinese context?
He certainly did. And that's why I find him particularly fascinating, because in his translations of the New Testament and the Psalms into classical Chinese, he took full advantage of his knowledge of the indigenous Chinese traditions and found ways of interpreting in his translation biblical terms in ways in which they could be understood by well-educated Chinese. The most obvious example is in his translation of the Gospel of John. He uses the term Dao, which, as you know, means the way, as his translation of Logos, the second person of the Trinity. And in choosing that Chinese word, which brings with it its own wealth of meaning in the Taoist and Buddhist and Confucian traditions, using that term to translate a concept so fundamental in the Christian tradition, he opened a variety of opportunities for cross-cultural interpretation that had never been, or had seldom been explored earlier, certainly not in the earlier translations of the Bible, which are all done into Baihua, into colloquial Chinese, and in which those kinds of interpretive translations were conscientiously avoided. The way in which the Protestant translations of the Bible handled Logos was to take or even the early Jesuit translations, they took the Latin translation of Logos as verbum and put together 3 Chinese characters, which sounded like verbum when you read them aloud, rather than actually daring to suggest that there is something about the notion of Logos which is analogous to what Chinese have meant by the term Tao.
It's very interesting. Yeah, wonderful. Well, I also understand. First, before I forget, I wanted to just note that you worked with a student at Notre Dame. Feel free to expand, or as you will, on John, who did a doctoral dissertation on John Wu. So if you wanted to comment on that.
Yes.
But then the second follow-up is just to speak about Zen Buddhism in particular. Already a couple of people have asked questions about Zen that we'll get to. But I understand John Wu was particularly interested in Zen. So those 2 questions, yeah.
Yeah, he was, in his earlier writings comparing Christianity with Chinese traditions, he focused especially on Taoism and Confucianism. But later in life, perhaps at the instigation of Thomas Merton, with whom he had struck up a friendship.
The Trappist from Columbia University, later Gethsemane in Kentucky. Yeah.
Right, yes. Merton had an interest in Zen, which he had developed on his own, and entered into correspondence with John Wu, which I think prompted Wu to explore more deeply than he had previously the teachings of Zen. And he wrote a book still admired by scholars, even specialists in the history of Zen Buddhism, called The Golden Age of Zen, in which he translated sayings from the masters of the Zen tradition in the Golden Age of Zen, the Tang Dynasty. And he found elements of the Zen tradition to be reminiscent of or suggestive of claims that were made in various Catholic or Christian mystical traditions. He explored what he perceived to be similarities between the insights of Zen masters, Chan masters, and you would say in Chinese, and people like Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, of course, Meister Eckhart was, in his translations and explanations of Zen texts, would frequently point out what seemed to him to be analogies between Zen and the Christian mystical tradition. But he saw Zen, along with Taoism and Confucianism, to be forms of what were called in those days natural mysticism, as opposed to supernatural mysticism. He has a very, I thought, fascinating metaphor. He saw himself, he says in one of his writings, his autobiographical writing, he said, "I see myself as a magus, one of the magi, who brings to the Christian tradition the gold of Taoism, the myrrh of Confucianism, and the frankincense of Zen Buddhism." Right? He sees these things as precious and as possibly to be used as a gift to Christianity, but not as, in any respect, alternatives to the Christian spiritual tradition, as ways of enriching the Christian spiritual tradition.
Hmm.
Uh,
And did you want to mention anything about the work of your student here in World
yes, I
Religions,
did. I
World
should have
Church?
mentioned earlier. One of my last doctoral student. I only had two here at Notre Dame, but my last student wrote his dissertation on John Wu's translation, especially of the Gospel of John. He had been himself an admirer of Wu before he came to Notre Dame. Came to Notre Dame in large part because he learned that I had been a student of John Wu, and maintained very close relationships with John Wu's surviving son, and did a fine dissertation on that, analyzing the various ways in which John Wu used the resources of the Chinese intellectual and literary traditions to convey the meanings of the New Testament to an educated Chinese audience.
And this is John Lindblom.
Oh, I'm sorry, I
Yes.
should have mentioned
Yes.
Another John Lindblom.
Another John, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
He works now, he does not work in academia, but works for a congressional commission, which deals with the topic of religious freedom in Asia, particularly in China.
Well, maybe we'll get in one last really quick question from Xueying, and then we'll turn to the audience. Is that okay? So
Please.
Do you have one more? Do you think, Xueying, should we go right to the audience? What do you think?
I have one very, very, hopefully this is not a very impossible question, but you've mentioned that John Wu did not see Christianity as you know what, because we talked about how Christians have viewed Buddhism, but let me turn the story around. So how have Chinese Buddhists historically viewed Christianity, and especially Jesus?
Yeah, that's, I had touched on that topic briefly in passing a moment or two ago. Chinese intellectuals, until very recently, John Wu being a major exception to this rule, were not much interested in the Christian tradition. There were intellectuals in other parts of the Asian world who were deeply interested in exploring relationships between Buddhism and Christianity, but that seldom happened in China. I spent nearly a year, several decades ago, teaching at a Chinese Buddhist institute in Taiwan, founded and led by one of the most eminent contemporary Chinese Buddhist thinkers and religious leaders, who was deeply learned in the traditions of Buddhism in China. This man once wrote a book on Christianity, which was a woeful failure. It betrayed a very superficial and often quite erroneous view of the nature of Christianity. So he's quite different from, for example, major figures in the Japanese Buddhist tradition, who have deeply and respectfully explored similarities and differences between Buddhism and Christianity. Buddhists in China were not much interested in Christianity. There are only a few exceptions to that rule.
Great. Okay, thank you so much. And now I'm going to turn right away to the questions we're receiving. There's some great ones. We have about 9 minutes, so I'll try to go quickly, and hopefully we can get through a number of them. And these are questions, for both of you. Some are addressed specifically to Professor Gemello, but Xueying, please don't hesitate to add your own perspective. So first, we have a question from Tucson, and it's sort of a factual question. Can you give a brief breakdown of the percentage of basically demographics? So what percentage of the Chinese population would self-identify as Buddhist, also as Catholic, and if you want to mention others, Taoist, etc.
I wish I could give reliable information on that score. There was a time, earlier in the 20th century, when scholars would try to assemble population counts of the various world religions. And Buddhism always came out at the top of the list because people commonly added the entire population of China to the category of Buddhism. I do not myself, I'm not myself able to tell you now how many Chinese in contemporary China would regard themselves as Buddhists, or for that matter, how many would regard themselves as Taoists or Confucians. And the problem is all the more difficult because there has been a tradition in Chinese religious history of amalgamating various traditions. So it became quite common, for example, for Chinese to reserve one compartment of life to one religion. Their public career, for example, would, in that context, they identify themselves as Confucians. In their private lives, they might identify themselves as Taoists. In their pursuit of ultimate salvation, they might identify themselves as Buddhists. And generally speaking, there are exceptions, but generally speaking, Chinese did not find it necessary to choose one of those three. So very hard to make a count, right?
Professor Wang, do you want to add anything on that question?
Yes, as Professor Gemello has mentioned, there are varying degree of devotion among Buddhists. So there's Buddhist specialists, as we would call them, and it's just like an impression that I think most Chinese practice it. They have an altar or something of the Buddha, but then they also can consider themselves something else easily. But the official number, as I checked last time, given by the government of how many Buddhists there are in China is 200 million. So the entire population is 1.5 billion. So I guess we can calculate.
But we don't know what that number really means. So, right.
Yeah.
Well, we have two questions on Zen in particular, so I'm going to try to join them together. One is from Ottawa. And the question is, can you speak to the relationship of Zen as practiced by many of different traditions to Chinese Buddhism? So, what is distinct about Zen? And then the other, again, is how unique a contribution is Chan, I don't know if I'm saying that right, Zen, to the larger world of Buddhism. But it follows up with a question about what is the transformation of the Buddhist Avalokitesvara, I don't know if you recognize that, into the female figure of Guanyin, show about the Chinese flavor of religiosity. So I probably got that all wrong, at least the pronunciation, but could you comment on Zen and maybe that follow-up?
Yeah.
Professor Gemello.
Zen is a form, a tradition, a collection of traditions of Buddhism that began in China. Maybe if we had to date its origin, be back in the 6th century. These were practitioners of Buddhism who modified the Buddhism they'd received from India in various practical ways, with an emphasis on the practice of meditation as distinct from the study of doctrine or the performance of ritual. The word Chan, pronounced in Japanese Zen, means meditation. So the Chan tradition is the tradition which emphasizes, among the various options for the Buddhist life, the practice of meditation. And it developed its own how to describe it. It's actually a form of Mahayana Buddhism. Its essential doctrinal themes are those of the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, but expressed in a very distinctive literary manner by Chinese who in the Zen tradition tried to avoid the use of Indian verbal categories and use instead Chinese idioms. So it's Mahayana Buddhism in a distinctively Chinese idiom, beginning in around 600 and continuing down to modern times. Right? A lot more to be said about that, of course, but that's what Chan or Zen is, right?
Thank you. And then a question about, this is coming from Bonita Springs. Could Dr. Gemello speak more of the idea of traditional Chinese Buddhism not being engaged in a moral critique of the institutional or political system? So I think there's maybe a common understanding that Chinese Buddhism is politically maybe quietist or passive. Is that a right understanding? Maybe we'll start with Professor Gemello and then Professor Wang, if you wanted to add to that.
Xueying, you have something to say on that topic?
No, I'm actually very curious to hear what you would say.
Okay, right. There's a lot of attention being paid in contemporary Western Buddhism to what is called engaged Buddhism. Buddhism that is systematically involved in the critique and reform of society. that was, again, speaking at a level of high generality, that was not an important feature of the pre-modern Chinese Buddhist tradition. If anything, in terms of its political involvement, Buddhist institutions throughout pre-modern Chinese history were allied with the government, even with despotic forms of the government. And the notion of Buddhist practice as having an ethical component that expressed itself in politics and the like was very rare in pre-modern China. This all came to my attention when I was a graduate student at Columbia in the 60s, when student protests against the Vietnam War were developing. And one of my friends at that time was Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Buddhist monk who many people know. I was asked to participate in one of those teach-ins, if you can remember that antique term. I was supposed to talk about Chinese Buddhist pacifism. And I remembered scouring all the books in my library and not finding, this was somewhat surprising to me, anything like a consistent pacifist position within the Chinese Buddhist tradition. That's a very recent form of what is nowadays called in the West, engaged Buddhism, what is called in Chinese, Renjian Fojiao, humanistic Buddhism. But that's a rather recent development, I think.
And then very briefly, maybe we'll just get this last question in, just so we can have some references for further study about John Wu in particular. Do you have a book, an article, a website, if people wanted to discover more of his thought?
There are Chinese websites which contain all of his writings and the like. But I think the best thing to use in beginning to acquaint yourself with John Wu is his autobiography, Beyond East and West, which has recently been republished. It's a remarkably honest and thorough account of John Wu's life up until the late 1950s, and very much focused on the process by which he converted to Catholic Christianity. And it's, apart from everything else, it's a wonderful read. So Beyond East and West, John C.H. Wu's autobiography. That's a place to start. Right.
And I would draw attention also to all of our audience to the lecture that Professor Gemello gave at Santa Clara University. One of our questioners actually alludes to it. This is someone from South Bend. We won't get to the question, unfortunately, but I'd really encourage everyone. It's linked in week 2 of this mini course, The Church in Asia. So you'll find it there, the link to it. It's up on YouTube. And I believe John Wu's grandson was there in the audience. Is that right, Professor Gemello?
Right. He had something to say before I began to speak. And I hope you enjoy it, right?
Wonderful. Well, friends, thank you so much for joining us today for the second of our 3-part series on the Church in Asia. We're not done yet, so please come back next week for part 3, where we'll be discussing more questions about the contemporary life of Christians in Asia and some of the complicated theological, but also political and social questions. The director's letter that will be released on Monday will have more information about that. And we just remind you that you don't have to start from the beginning. If you want to invite friends to participate, they can catch up by watching the recordings of week 1 or 2 if they want to, or they can just join for week 3. You're always welcome to join. So please feel free to share the news, spread the good news to your friends and to everyone else. They just need to register for free and they'll have access to all of the material. And then finally, Professor Wang, thank you so much for being with me again.
Thanks for having me.
And Professor Gemello, that was awesome. Thank you so much for the wealth of knowledge, for all the work you've done for the University of Notre Dame, for our students, and he's been a really esteemed colleague and someone I've looked up to. And thank you also for today's session, Professor Gemello.
It's been my pleasure. And good to see you again, Xueying, right? So,
good to see you.
right.
Best wishes to all. Thank you.
Right. Bye.